if you're around someone, if you're not doing very well, especially if that's your own fault, if you're not doing very well and you're around someone who's doing very well, it's very painful because the mere fact of their being judges you. And so it's very easy to want to destroy that ideal, so that you don't have to live with the terrible consequences of seeing it embodied in front of you. And so part of the reason that people want to tear things down is so that they don't have anything to contrast themselves against and to feel bad. And that's exactly what's happening here. The kids are destroying all of this culture, roughly speaking, because it judges them. The fact that it exists judges them. And I've often thought this about Michelangelo's statue of David, which is this heroic, so David was a shepherd, obviously, and it doesn't sound like much, but back in those times, being a shepherd was a big deal because there were lions and you had a slingshot, and so like you got to defend your sheep from lions with a slingshot. So you weren't exactly this like 19th century English guy dressed in a, you know, frilly blue suit. You were tough as a bloody, well, as someone who would go after a lion with a slingshot. It's no joke. Anyways, the statue is very heroic, and you know, you look at that and you think, well, that's the possibility of humankind, but by the same token, it's also what you're not. And so, as well as being an ideal, it's a judge, and every ideal is a judge. So, yes?
Going back to your example of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So you're using that as an example to illustrate becoming bitter as a result of not being able to achieve
sure
status as a result
success
of,
even
success as a result of hard work. But in the example of Cain and Abel, like one was a shepherd and the other was a farmer, and the one who
one is, yes, that's right, one,
and
yes,
the one who was a shepherd was the one who was favored.
Yes, that's right.
So was that a result of the hard work, or was that a result of
good question. The stories, well, that's a good question. Those stories are very, very complicated, and the story is very ambivalent about whether Cain is not rewarded because he makes bad sacrifices or because God's just in a bad mood. And I like that. If you read the story, I've read multiple translations of the story, and when Cain comes to God to complain, God basically tells him, look, buddy, before you go about criticizing the structure of reality, you should look to your own inadequacies. He says, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you, and something has emerged as a consequence. So don't be bothering me about my creation before you look to yourself. So there's a very strong hint that the reason that God has not favored Cain's sacrifices is because they weren't of particularly good quality. So, but it is ambivalent in the story, and there is the shepherd versus farmer motif as well. And of course that motif runs through the entire corpus of stories to some degree, especially the shepherd motif. So it's only about a paragraph long, that whole story, and it packs all that into that tiny little amount of space. But the idea that Cain kills Abel to get rid of his ideal and also to punish God, roughly speaking, it's a brilliant story. I mean, these guys who go around shooting up high schools, or shooting up high schools in particular, but you know, they're definitely out for revenge, and what they're revenging themselves against or to who is not exactly clear. Anyway, so these kids are just tearing down this model home, tearing down Western civilization, I suppose is another way of looking at it, or just tearing down civilization, period. And Pinocchio's having a pretty good time. He's got his axe and he's looking a little malevolent there, and happy to be destroying things, which is of course a pretty simple thing to do. So there's that image that I told you about, the mandala. That's a flower in this image. And so what happens is that I think it's Lampwick throws a brick through it. And so what that means symbolically is the self is a symbol of your potential, among very many other things. But by engaging in this sort of impulsive, destructive activity, Lampwick and Pinocchio are making it impossible for them to further their development. And they're doing that to some degree consciously. You know, they basically say to hell with it and toss a brick through this highest ideal, the thing through which light shines. So also that harkens back to the star as well. So anyways, the coachman is paying attention to all this, and he's actually pretty happy about the fact that these boys are so involved in their stupid amusements that that they're not paying any attention to what's actually going on. And he calls these people out of the darkness, these creatures out of the darkness. So you get these black, you can hardly see them there, but they're black cloaked figures with glowing eyes, and they're shutting the door of the amusement park. And that's very interesting. It's an extraordinarily interesting happening. It's like, okay, so all of a sudden the amusement park is associated, we already know that the coachman is up to no good, but now he's got these minions that are faceless in some sense. They're clearly creatures of the night, and they're up to no good. And so you have the sense that the boys are being offered bread in circuses, roughly speaking, but there's a real reason for it. There's a manipulative reason for it. They're being enticed into a trap, and the doors are closed, and these underground beings are involved in the plot. And obviously the coachman understands this perfectly well. And so one of the ways to understand this is to think about what totalitarian states have to offer their populace and what they offer them. And this happened particularly as Rome declined, let's say. That's where the term bread and circuses originally came from, is that as the situation degenerates, then people have to be offered stupid amusements more and more frequently in order for them to ignore what's actually going on in the background. And, a war can be that kind of stupid amusement. Anyways, later that night, the entire place is completely devastated, and all we see is the wreckage of everything that was there before. And again, the cricket has got separated from Pinocchio, and so he's trying to find him, and Pinocchio ends up in this bar that's shaped like an 8-ball. 8-ball is kind of the random ball in pool. And anyways, he's inside the 8-ball, and he's shooting pool with Lampwick, and that's just another indication of wasting his time, basically. And you can see in the forefront there's some cards for gambling, and so he's engaged in these sort of, you might say, pointless, hedonic pursuits, and he's enticing Pinocchio along the same route. And so he teaches him to smoke first. That doesn't go very well. So Pinocchio takes a huge drag on a cigar, and it just about kills him. And when Lampwick asks him how he likes it, he shakes his head and says, that was really quite good, but he's so sick that he can hardly stand up, and he's hallucinating double balls on the pool table. And then the cricket shows up and stands on the 8-ball and kind of gives one of those declamatory speeches again, because he still hasn't quite figured out that standing up proud and spouting off the rules isn't exactly the right way for the conscience to behave. And Lampwick picks him up by the scruff of the neck, roughly speaking, and first of all asks who he is. So obviously he's divorced from his own conscience, and then makes fun of Pinocchio for paying attention to this little bug. And that's kind of a nice indication of what happens in adolescence, because of course as the children move away from their parents and into their groups, especially when the groups are misbehaving, often what happens is that the other members of the group will torture a person who isn't willing to try something dangerous or foolish by making fun of the fact that they're, too attached to their conscience. And there's a positive element to that, because you should take some risks when you're a teenager and also later in life. And so if you won't take any risks, there's actually something wrong with you. But there's a negative element in that, teenagers do all sorts of stupid things, and perhaps it's amazing that we all live through it, actually, as far as I'm concerned. And some people take extraordinary risks, and they don't make it through at all, or they end up in the permanently antisocial population. And then they're, basically career criminals. 5% of the criminals commit 95% of the crimes. It's another Pareto distribution. So, anyways, Lampwick isn't going to listen to Pinocchio or to the cricket. He laughs at him with this kind of braying laugh, which is some foreshadowing, and the cricket gets all upset, puts his coat on backwards, and ends up dumped down a pool table hole and otherwise abused. And so he stomps on out of there. He tells Pinocchio that he can take care of himself, and he stomps on out of there. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right. Men have no idea how to treat women if they're in male power hierarchies. They have no idea how to treat them. And that's because we have no idea how to do that. No one has any idea how to do that. It's only been happening in any, pronounced sense for about, well, on a societal level, really probably since the mid-70s. It's 3 generations. It's a drop in the bucket. And it's a very, very difficult thing to sort out. So men are slightly bigger than women. And that's also generally characteristic of creatures that have a dominance hierarchy that's tilted towards masculine. And then the other factor seems to be that human beings have, their infants, our infants, have very, 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 very long periods of dependence. And it's very difficult to maneuver your way doing anything, really, especially anything that has to do with competition and power, if you're taking care of, one infant, let alone 3. And so it seems to me that those are all valid reasons why the primary power structures among human beings have typically been male and why they're represented as masculine. Now, there are other reasons too, because this is a multifaceted phenomenon. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting about human females is that they're selective maters. Now, chimp females are not selective maters, and what that means is that the dominant males still have most of the offspring, but the reason for that, apparently, is because they chase the subordinate males away from sexually receptive females. Although the sexually receptive females will sneak off behind a rock somewhere and mate with a subordinate male. But as long as the dominant male is around, the probability of that is quite low, so that the female chimps aren't sexually selective. Whereas human females have concealed ovulation so that no one knows when they're at their most fertile, and they're selective maters. And women in every society virtually that's ever been studied have a typical pattern of behavior, which is that if you look at the female dominance hierarchy and you look at the male dominance hierarchy, the females will mate across and up dominance hierarchies, and the males will mate across and down, which works fine, both genders, because their interests align. But it also means that, in all likelihood, that women have exerted tremendous sexual selection pressure on men. And that might be part of the reason, of the many reasons that we actually, the theory is that the common ancestor between chimps and humans was a lot more like a modern chimp, than like a modern human. So for whatever reason, we've undergone a lot more transformation in the last 7 million years than chimps have. And one possible reason for that, and I think it's a highly probable reason, is that sexual selection operated a lot more viciously, so to speak, among humans. It's operated to the point where you have twice as many female ancestors as male. And you might think, well, that can't be possible, but here's how it's possible. It's like only every second man had a child. Well, all women had 1. Now, of course, that isn't what happened. But on average, that's what happened. So who's responsible for the male dominance hierarchy? Because you could say, well, it's male competitiveness, but you could also say, yeah, well, it's an inevitable function of female selection. And so, which is not an argument that you hear very often. But I think it's a very difficult argument to escape from. And that leads us to our next hypothesis. So we're going to say, well, the masculine dominance hierarchy is represented as masculine. I'm going to call that the Great Father for the time being. And that's the permanent dominance hierarchy of men. And it's always there. It moves through history. It's different men all the time. But it's like the men slot in and out as they are born and die, but the structure itself stays intact across forever. It's always there. It's been there at least for millions of years. So for our purposes, we'll just call it permanent. It's a permanent part of experience. And it's a big part of it. And, as culture gets more and more, covers larger and larger expanses of territory and gets more and more sophisticated, it's an ever larger part of reality. So I mean, most of us spend almost all our time coping with the dominance hierarchy and almost none of our time combating nature. You know, you get wet, and today you get wet for a little while and that's it, you know, but most of the problems that you would face in a purely natural environment, it's like you're so distant from them that you can hardly even imagine. You can't even imagine what it would be like in some sense to be in an environment like that. So the question was, what drives women to move to the top of the hierarchy? It's something that's worth discussing. So if anybody objects to what I'm going to say, then please do, because I'm not, you know, dishing this out as received truth. I've been trying to figure this out, and this is what it looks like to me. The first thing is I think that male and female dominance hierarchies both exist, but they're different. And that females compete with each other intensely, but they don't compete for the same things. And they don't compete the same way. So let me tell you a little story. This is a bit of a divergence, but it's an interesting point. And one of the questions I've always been asked in this class is, because I'm going to lay out a hero story for you, and the fundamental hero archetype. And the hero is masculine in mythology. And so the women always ask, well, what about the role of the woman? And it's like, it's very, very complex, which of course all you women already know, because it is very, very complex. So, but it isn't something that, first of all, I don't think it was a question that would have been asked before the invention of the birth control pill. Because we know what the archetypal female is prior to that. It's the Virgin Mary with child. It's virgin with child, which means like it means that the unit for woman is woman with child. It's not woman. It's woman with child. And well, it's obvious why that is, because as soon as you become a woman in most societies, you have a child. Before that, you're a girl, and that's, you know, that's in some sense that's irrelevant, you know, in terms of your destiny. Now you might say, well, what's your archetypal pattern if you're not a mother? Well, the way it looks to me is that there's two archetypes for personal development, for the personal path, roughly speaking. There's the hero, and that would be the person who explores the unknown and discovers something of value and brings it back and distributes it to the community. So it's like a hunting. It's probably predicated on a hunting platform, because our bodies are hunting platforms, basically. So, you know, and one theory about what men did, which is a very probable theory, is that they went out and hunted for meat. And chimps like meat. They'll eat it whenever they can, although they're not very good hunters, but they will definitely eat meat. And human beings are so good at hunting that we probably, well, for example, we probably wiped out the mammoths. And when human beings came into North America, there was as many different kinds of large animals in North America as there was in Africa, and human beings killed all of them. And that was just with, you know, like, they didn't have our notion of technologically sophisticated weapons. It was bows and arrows and clubs and spears, and nonetheless, like, they got rid of everything, you know. Large cats, giant beavers, mammoths. I mean, part of the reason that I'm thinking about these sorts of things is because I've been very interested in the fact that men are doing very badly in junior high and high school, and they're bailing out of the universities like mad. Like, at the rate it's going, there'll be almost no men in most disciplines within 10 years. So, I mean, you can tell that even in this class. You know, although it's funny, because on my YouTube videos, I look at the gender distribution for viewing, and it's 80% male. So anyways, back to the archetypal representation. I think really the way to think about it is that for men, the hero archetype is the archetype that's dominant and in the forefront, and the maternal archetype is subordinate and in the background. I mean, inside their own psyches. Whereas with women, it's reversed. So each of the genders can play the role of the other gender, but there's a tilt in each of them towards the, what would you say? Well, towards gender, I would say, towards typical human gender normative behavior. Now, the social constructionists believe that no such thing exists, but those people are so pathological that even considering what they have to say is a mistake. So, you know, they act as if there is no biology and everything's cultural, and it's like, well, no, that's just not right. Now, what biology means in practice and what you should do about it, that's a whole different question. But to think of all these differences as socially height differences between men and women are not socially constructed. And they're relevant. And the upper body strength differences between men and women are not socially constructed, and they're relevant too. You know? So one of the things I was wondering about, maybe you guys can help me clarify this or tell me where I'm not thinking about this properly. And if you think if I'm missing something, let me know. One of the things my daughter said, she watched my son one day have a fight with his best friend. It was a physical fight, you know, and so his best friend did something that my son didn't regard as appropriate, and so he hit him, and then there was a fight, and then, you know, 3 days later they were friends again. And my daughter said to me that she was very annoyed by that, which wasn't the fight exactly, but the fact that they could have a fight and then they were friends again 3 days later, because she said that option wasn't available to women. Right? Now, and the option that the men have is, well, if you get out of hand, I'll just sock you one. And then we'll have established where the boundaries of civilized behavior begin and end. And I would say that, in my experience, if I'm talking to someone who's self-confident and masculine and accomplished, there's always an undercurrent of potential violence. It's an undercurrent. And that's actually an undercurrent of respect, which means like there's things that we can do to each other in a civilized way, but there are rules that if you break, like all hell's going to break loose. And one of the consequences of that is that it doesn't, right? Now, the typical bullying pattern for women in high school and junior high is reputation destruction. And I'm wondering, what are the implications for the conduct of behavior if there is no recourse to aggression to solve disputes? Because they don't get solved. You know, I've tried to analyze what it means to say no to someone. Because no means something, right? No means, well, if you tell a child no, what you're basically telling the child, as far as I can tell, is that if you continue doing that, something you don't like will happen to you. And then if you're civilized at saying no, what happens is you say no a couple of times, and then instead of devaluing the word, which is what you do if you just said it over and over 100 times with no consequences, you take action that's nonverbal. And so one of the things you might do is remove the child from the situation, or you might put them on the steps, or maybe you put them on the steps and they run away, so you have to hold them on the steps. But the point to the child is, there are limits, and if you exceed them, you will be physically controlled. What if there's no option for physical control? What happens? Well, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what women do about that, but I also don't know what men do about that in relationship to women.